Hello, welcome to this short video where I'm going to be talking about what it means to have the right to do something. So with our language arts program, we just wrapped up animal defense mechanisms. We were actually super close to finishing, and then now that we're starting online, I'm just going to kind of cut it clean off and we'll start the new module. So in this new module that we'll be focusing on for the next few months, we're thinking a lot about what it means to have the right to do something. So I want you to think and reflect for yourself for a minute. What does it mean to have the right to do something? So that something could be the right to vote. It could be the right to free speech. It could be the right to bear arms. Have you ever heard of the term right being used that way? And I'm not talking about like your right hand or about your right. I'm talking about a right, as in a right to vote or a right to free speech. So think about it in your head for a second. What might it mean to have a right to do something? You can think like Winnie the Pooh or like Batman. A right means that you have the freedom to do something. So for example, if you have the right to vote, that means you have the freedom to choose. You have the freedom to vote. If you have the right to free speech, it means that you have the freedom to be able to speak your mind. In our society, we believe that there are certain rights that we have, or freedoms that are allowed to us just because we are members of this society, of this country. So I want to talk to you about a story that I had the first year I taught about rights that kind of backfired on me, and this is a pretty good story. So I thought about, what if, to help kind of illustrate what it means to have the right to vote, I let the students vote on something. So I decided with the class that we were going to have a new class mascot, that it was going to be like our class name, our class mascot, that we could choose to like kind of, it'd just be like a fun activity that we could have that, like this is our class name. And I got the students really pumped up about it, and I was sharing with them like this would be like so cool that if we have a class mascot, and then everywhere we all go, then people are like, oh, there's the fourth grade, such and such. And so this is what I did. That year, I had quite a few more boys than girls. I actually didn't have very many girls. And so I divided them up in boys and girls. And I said, what you need to do in your groups is figure out what you want your class mascot name to be. And then after that, we'll come back with two choices, and then the whole class can vote. And so the boys in my class, they were thinking that they had it in the bag because they knew that there were more boys than girls in the class. And so just to be funny, they tried picking a name that was just so over the top, boyish that they kind of knew the girls weren't going to like it. And I can't remember the name of it. It was something like, I don't know, we'll just say like the moon blasting robots is what they came up with. And the girls, to their credit, they also came up with a name that was also very kind of traditionally girly, where they came up, and there's the name I can't even remember, but they came up with like the pink frosted fairies or something like that, and it was a great name. I mean, I thought they both were great, but they both knew that the other group wouldn't like their name. So I go to vote for the class. We come back together, and the boys are just thinking they've got it in the bag because they know they have more students in the class, that there's more boys in the class than girls, and that they're going to win the vote. So I go to say, all right, class, let's go and vote. And we had little scraps of paper that they circled it and they folded it and put it in a thing. And right before I started, this is where it gets tricky, right? I only ran off enough voting slips for the girls in my class, not the boys. And so when I went to go and do the vote, I only passed out these slips to the girls, right? So, and then the boys were like, wait, why? Why don't we get to vote? I said, well, you can give me input, but you don't get a vote in here. And like, yeah, we do. No, we don't. No, just the girls get a vote. That's just how my class works. That's how it's always worked. That's how it's worked all year. We just hadn't done any votes that year, right? That's how it's always worked, is I let the girls vote in my class and not the boys. And so the girls, which one did they vote for? You guessed it, the pink frosted fairies. And so the boys were absolutely livid. Livid just means really upset. And this is where it started to kind of spiral out of control, because we had recess right after that. And out at recess, the boys had like held an all-boy meeting about what they were going to do. And they started making picket signs. So they went and got papers that said, "We want to vote." And then I had students getting like mad at me. And then they went home and talked to their parents. And a few parents emailed me, be like, "Hey, so what's going on?" And so anyway, it kind of got out of control. But the point I want to make here is that the boys, when they were not allowed access to vote within my classroom, when they did not have the right to do it, they were very, very upset because they had ideas and they had a way that they wanted the direction of the class to shape with the class mascot idea. And then when they weren't allowed that, and just completely understandably, they were very, very upset. So we kind of I realized that day, all right, this got out of hand. I was a newer teacher back then, so so then the next day I held a meeting with the boys. I said, "So how did this make him feel?" And they said, "Well, it's not fair." They said the boys are part of the class too. They said, why should they live with something that they didn't have any say over? And those were all very justified thoughts. And so what I did after that is we just scrapped it all together, and I said everyone gets to vote on the next one. And then rather than having the boys decide a team name and the girls decide a team name, I had them in groups, boys and girls mixed, so they could come up with a class name, a class mascot name that worked for everyone, and they did. And it worked out really, really smoothly when everyone had the right to vote and everyone was working together. So in language arts, we're going to be talking over the next few weeks about what it means to have the right to vote and how the right to vote has changed over the last 100 years. So where we're starting at is we're going to start thinking about this in the early 1700s. I don't expect you to know all of the history of the United States and all that. But what I do expect you to know is let's just think about the trajectory or how voting has changed in the United States over time. So I'm going to say a lot of places you might be familiar with and a lot of dates that are a little bit abstract. And the point is, I don't need you to memorize each of those things. I just want you to be thinking about how votes have changed in the United States since its organization. So we'll start at 1776. That was the year that the Declaration of Independence was signed, and that's when the United States became an actual thing. Before then, they were just colonies that belonged to a different country. But then once they signed that, they said, hey, we're going to be our own country. So with that, in 1776, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and he was a slave owner, but he stated that all men are created equal. And so up until that point, men and women had the right to vote in the United States, but it was based on wealth. So if you were wealthy, you were able to vote and have access to how the government wanted to run things, and if you weren't as wealthy, you didn't have that access. So that was in 1776. In the next year, women lose the right to vote in the state of New York. In 1780, they lost the right to vote in Massachusetts, and in 1784, women lost the right to vote in New Hampshire. In 1787, so about 10 years later, there was the U.S. Constitution, which is like the law of the land. It was ratified, and it gave each state the ability to determine who would vote. And so most states restricted voting to male property owners, property owners meaning someone who owned land. And in order to own land, you have to have money. So for rich people, and most states restricted it to male, so men that were over the age of 21, and some states bar free African Americans from voting. So if you were a black person, you could not vote. In 1801, the residents of Washington, D.C., they lost their right to vote. 1807, women lost their rights to vote in the state of New Jersey, which was the last state to allow women to vote. So after 1807, women did not have the right, and there were no women in the United States that had the right to vote. In 1848, and we're going to talk a little bit tomorrow about 1848, but there was the Women's Rights Convention, which took place in Seneca Falls, New York, which tried to help bring awareness to the fact that people thought that women should have the right to vote. And then North Carolina got rid of the wealth requirement in 1856, wealth requirement for voting, the last state to do so, which means that they said anyone that's male can vote. You don't have to just own property. In 1867 and then 1870, the 14th Amendment makes African American citizens, but it defines the voters as only being able to be male. And then the 15th Amendment gave African American males the right to vote in 1870. And then in 1878, Congress rejects the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Susan B. Anthony Amendment was an amendment that was sent to Congress that said, hey, we think women should have the right to vote, and Congress rejected it. Let's go to a little bit more recent dates. 1898, the U.S. Supreme Court rules that U.S.-born children of immigrants are citizens. In 1920, the 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. That was 100 years ago. So we're going to focus a lot in this book that we're going to be reading, The Hope Chest. It takes place in 1920, and 1920 is a really interesting time. There's another video I have that's going to talk about that. But that was finally when women gave the right to vote, almost 60 years after that first convention 80 years after that first convention happened to help bring awareness to it. And then 1824, Native Americans were able to have the right to vote. And then 1943, Chinese Americans were able to have the right to vote. 1946, Filipinos received the right to vote. And then I'm going to skip over some of these. Japanese citizens in 1954. 1961, people in Washington, D.C. were able to. And then 1964, poll taxes were eliminated, which means before then, you'd have to pay money to go and vote, which was a problem because if you don't have money, you're not going to go vote. And then same thing, 1965, they got rid of reading tests, saying that only people who can read are able to vote, and that was a way that they kept some people not from voting. And then, and that's really about where I'll end for our purposes. So I hope in me talking about that timeline, you kind of saw that there was this history where people were losing the right to vote and they weren't able to have the right to vote. And then in the 1900s, so just the last century, like I was born in the 1900s, you have parents born in the 1900s and grandparents, that there was sort of this shift of the right to vote opening up to many more groups of people. So what I would like you to do into the comments below is the discussion board is just enter what's one thing that you learned through this 13-minute recording, and just 2 or 3 sentences. What's one thing that you learned about what it means to either have the right to vote or about the history of voting in the United States? Thanks for watching.